Here's Anne Thériault reading Quest for a Maid by Frances M. Hendry.
When I was 9 years old, I hid under a table and heard my sister kill a king. For 2 days, I'd had terrible toothache. I hid it as long as I could, for Dad had no patience with whining. But last night I'd tossed and wriggled and groaned in my bed till, what with my stir and my next-up sister Birgit beside me snarling at me to lie quiet and let her sleep, we woke the bairns, and they woke the babies, and they woke the house. Dad was annoyed.
Welcome to Pages Past, the podcast where we visit the Library of Memory. I'm Jenna Buck. In each episode, I invite a guest to choose a book from their far past to read and discuss. Through conversation and close reading, we'll find new meanings in our old favorite books. Today, my guest is Anne Thériault, a wonderful writer on religion and history and many other subjects. You may know her from the Queens of Infamy series or her work in the Walrus magazine or Broadview magazine. She is an amazing thinker and a dear friend. Anne, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the lovely, very flattering intro.
So we have a mutual love of plucky heroines in late 20th century girls' literature. And there are so many directions we could have gone in that sphere. But you chose Quest for a Maid by Frances Hendry. We are going to talk about what you could remember before you started rereading. So here is some of that conversation. Here's a bit about Anne's first memories with this book from when she was attending day camp around age 12 in Kitchener, Ontario, sometime in the 90s.
I was newly independent. It was the first time I was taking city buses by myself, and it was like quite a journey because the camp and the library were downtown and we lived in kind of the suburbs. And I would go to the library sometimes at lunch, sometimes after camp, and I was just like feeling my independence. And I can picture exactly the shelf that this book was on. There was this amazing shelf of YA historical fiction, although I don't think people really used the term YA back then, but they were novels that were for older tweens and teens. I was obsessed with all of these books, and then Quest for a Maid, I think it was on display. You know, they had the shelf, but then they would prop up some of the books on top of the shelf to show the cover. And it has a very dramatic cover of a little girl being rescued from the sea. They're all wearing these medieval outfits. Very compelling.
Do you remember why it stuck with you? What struck you?
There was kind of like an ensemble cast. I guess they were probably teenagers. Maybe they were tweens in the book. And, you know, obviously they were the ones kind of doing all of the action. They had to solve the crisis, whatever it was. And yeah, I really enjoyed that.
What made you want to revisit it?
It's just one of those books that I still think about, even though I don't have a very in-depth memory of it. But I obviously remembered the title. I remember one of the characters has a cleft palate, and people think he is intellectually delayed, but it turns out they just can't understand him when he speaks because of the cleft palate. But the one girl that meets him is finally like the first person who can understand him.
That's so cool. What do you think 12-year-old you was into about that? Like, not just this specific book, but what appealed to you about this type of literature? Because I also was into this at this age.
I think I have always really liked medieval stuff. When I was a kid, we didn't have a VCR. My grandparents had a VCR. They lived in Quebec, so we would visit them in the summer. And basically the only kids movie that they had recorded, they taped it off TV, was the Disney Robin Hood, where they're foxes. And I just watched this movie over and over and over as a kid, and I loved it so much. And I think what I really liked about this type of book is that when you're a kid, sometimes history can feel really like stuffy and serious and adult. So it was really interesting to have this other window into this world that is historical children, I guess, and to think about what people my age would be doing, how they would be living in different time periods and just kind of like the weird luck of the draw of when and where you're born.
Something that I think is endlessly fascinating, too. Anything particular about a 12-year-old you that you think is like something about her or what she was like back then that is going to come up for you as you read this? What were you like at that age?
You know, I was on the brink of going through a really hard time. Grade 7 was an awful year for me. This friend group that I had been tight with since like pretty much the beginning of elementary school ditched me. It was like I went back to school at the beginning of grade 7 and everyone else had gotten some kind of memo that we weren't dressing like kids anymore. We weren't interested in kids stuff. And I was like the only one that I was still wearing my little sweatshirts with cats on them and like interested in dolls and stuff.
Yeah, I was like obsessed with stickers at that age. There's an age where some people are leaps and bounds ahead and then you're still a kid. It's so awkward. And it's interesting that retreating into a book and then also retreating into the past is maybe something that would appeal to that kid.
Yeah, it was such a form of escapism. I read all the time. I read during breakfast. I read on the school bus to school. I would sometimes read under my desk and hide it from the teacher. I read in the bath. I like...
Yeah. Yeah, I think so many of those people who were like that as kids, like, were terrible, incurable scrollers.
Yeah. Yeah, that was like my phone. Like I would always have a book with me. And like if I had to wait in line at the bank and I was like, can't believe I have to be bored in line at the bank, I would pull out my book and read.
Yeah, I got dragged to endless junior hockey games and other hockey games. And I would sit there and it was like very rude, like very rude. I didn't care what was going on at the hockey game. I didn't care if it was a final. I would be sitting there reading in the seat that my parents had paid for. So yeah, I relate to that very much. Any part of it that you're most excited to revisit that you kind of remember, but you want to see what it looks like for real?
Yeah, I remember the main character is a girl and she's kind of like the heroine of the story and the driving force. I'm interested to revisit her as an adult and see. And I'm also interested, you know, I didn't know a lot about history at that point. So I'm interested to revisit it now as someone who like has like an okay grasp on the medieval period. This takes place somewhere in the British Isles. I remembered it being in England, but then I read the back of the book and it's actually Scotland.
It says Scotland. Yeah.
I'm interested to like revisit it with a historian's eye and be like, what's going on here?
I think it's going to be really interesting. I got it. I haven't cracked it yet, so I'm really excited to read as well. Before we go any further, let's drop this book into history and recap it for those who haven't read it or haven't read it in a while. Fair warning, this is your last chance to turn back. This podcast runs on spoilers. Quest for a Maid by Scottish children's author Frances Mary Hendry was published in 1988. It tells the story of 9-year-old Meg, the daughter of a Norwegian shipwright in 13th century Scotland. Meg, hiding in a store cupboard, overhears her eldest sister, Inga, who is a witch, make a deal with Lady O'Carrick, the noblewoman who is scheming to get her son on the Scottish throne. Inga agrees to kill the king in exchange for a high position in the lady's court. Inga, with help from the elderly maid Asa, makes herself appear as a fearsome specter in the king's path, throwing him and his horse off a cliff to his death. The heir to the throne is the dead king's baby granddaughter, Marie, but there are many claims and a conflict is brewing. One day, in a crowd of people ogling a beached whale, Meg meets a little boy, Davy, with a severe cleft lip and palate. Unlike others, she understands him, sticks up for him, and saves him from drowning. As a thank you, Davy's father, a shipmaster, arranges for Meg and Davy to be married in 7 years' time. As was the custom at that time, Meg moves in with Davy's family to train to run their household. In other child marriage news, the young heir, Marie, will be married to the son of the King of England to broker peace. Meg cleverly rescues a young boy, Peem, from the evil local lord. He becomes her loyal servant. Over 6 years, the three of them, Meg, Peem, and Davy, grow close, and Meg's father builds them a little boat to sail in. Asa, the elderly maid, makes a prophecy that either Inga or Meg will kill the other. Each sister promises she won't, but Inga, half joking, says, "Not first, anyway, but if you scratch me, I'll scratch you right back." When Meg is 15, Inga is charged with witchcraft. Meg is forced to testify, but her denials aren't very convincing, so Inga endures a drowning ordeal. She survives, but just barely, and seems to take this as the scratch from Meg that entitles her to scratch back. The little girl queen-to-be, Marie, is now about 8, and Davy's father captains a ship to collect her from where she's living in Norway to deliver her to her wedding. Through Inga's scheming, Meg ends up on the ship as Marie's companion. They pick up Marie, a sweet and good-natured but sickly child, and on the way back, Pim and Davy catch up with the ship in their little boat to warn them that Inga plans to kill Marie so her boss, Lady O'Carrick's son, can take the throne. On board, they foil an assassination attempt. Someone put poison in medicine intended for Marie. Inga conjures a storm that capsizes the ship, killing Davy's father and many others. Pim, Davy, Marie, and Meg escape in the little boat, washing ashore and sheltering with a farmer, pretending to be servants. They hide Marie's identity because she doesn't want to be queen. Months later, on the way home, now harboring a fugitive in Marie, they meet a beggar woman Meg once helped and learn Meg's father has died and his shipyard burned. The woman, maybe for money, turns them in to the evil local lord, sending soldiers after them. The 4 friends escape into the forest on foot, but who do they meet but Inga? Inga's boss, Lady O'Carrick, and Lady O'Carrick's husband and son, who, remember, are in line for the throne. Inga tries to wheedle the real story of the shipwreck out of Meg. The Lord shows up with his army and tries to beat it out of her. Marie, unable to stand this, pops up out of her hiding place, and Lady O'Carrick swiftly stabs her. Inga tells her boss that wasn't really necessary. Marie was no longer an obstacle to the throne. Lady O'Carrick's son hears this and, realizing his mother hired a witch and killed a child to get him on the throne, says no thanks and takes off. It dawns just then on Lady O'Carrick's husband that she planned to off him as well, so he leaves too, leaving her screaming, "All I do is for you!" Lady O'Carrick and the evil lord decide to slaughter anyone present who might speak of this. Meg tries to throw herself in front of Inga, but Inga knocks Meg aside and is stabbed, giving Meg time to escape with Pim and Davy. Later, they return to where Inga lays dying. Inga apologizes for how things turned out. She declines last rites or a Christian burial, stating ominously that she has lived by her master's law, and tells Meg she loves her and to be happy before dying. Marie jumps back up. She was just playing dead, saved from serious injury by a silver brooch and some possible magic from Inga. The 4 friends bury Inga and hatch a plan to start a business together in Belgium, where no one will know them. Meg confesses that she loves Davy only as a brother and prefers to marry Pim, who is thrilled and had hoped for this all along. They leave to start their new life together. And that's Quest for a Maid by Frances M. Hendry. I would like to say thanks to Lindsey from Young Adult Historical Vault for writing a blog post summarizing Quest for a Maid that provided a very helpful starting place for this one. So let's catch up with Anne now that we have both read Quest for a Maid. You talked about how in the action the kids are in this book. They are driving this story and they are so independent and ingenious and they are sailing skiffs. You know, they are just so brave. And I do think that even at the time of this book, like 1988, people had the idea that kids weren't very independent, that kids were passive, that kids didn't have these skills anymore. I think that was very present even by the time this book came out. It's even more present now. And I'm wondering how that struck you on a reread. Were you thinking about how independent these kids are? Fictional kids, to be fair.
I mean, I guess in any kind of YA, you kind of have the problem of you have to get the parents out of the way somehow so that the kids can do their thing.
Always.
These kids are kind of, I don't want to say thrown to the wolves from an early age, but they are definitely doing their own thing and expected to do their own thing. And I think there's kind of a range of that too, because you have one character who's quite lowborn, and he has a very different experience from Davy, who is not noble, but his father is quite a wealthy merchant, and he's had quite a different upbringing than even Meg, who's kind of in the middle of the two.
Yeah, Meg is sent off to start training to run her own household at the age of like 7 or something. She is a little girl, and she's in marriage boot camp, which is so striking now. I know it's supposed to be medieval times, but it's not really remarked on. They don't really say, and this is child marriage, and that's wrong.
Right.
Yeah. It's really normalized in the universe of the book, which is something I think might not really fly today as well. We discussed the disability representation in this book. You had recalled correctly that there's a character with a cleft lip, cleft palate, and he's very underestimated, that people assume that he's not smart and can't understand them because he's got some speech challenges. But the heroine kind of sees through this and is able to communicate with him and help him communicate with others. And I wondered what you made of the way that disability is represented in this book.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's Davy, who has the cleft palate, and he probably experiences the most challenges from his disability. But we also have Meg's father, who is missing a leg, and we don't meet Meg's mother because she dies when Meg is born, but we are told that she was missing an arm and had quite severe facial scarring from a burn. And I also think, like, in a way, Meg's sister Inga, who's a witch, I think in a way, like, being a witch is kind of a disability too.
She's marked as different. I think that, especially for the time, it's a pretty positive framing of disability. He is really portrayed mainly in terms of his personality, in terms of his character, and once in a while reminding you that he has this facial difference, because he's very, very capable and he has a mind of his own, and they don't make the disability his personality trait, which I really appreciate. I also liked how they talked a little bit about how people thought about disability in the framework of the time. The idea that it was a curse and that his mother had looked at a hair when she was pregnant and this had caused a hair lip. It never hurts to be reminded about the way that people thought about things.
I like that his parents aren't fazed by his disability. They have a hard time, I think, understanding his speech, but they're fully in his corner. They don't think he's a demon or cursed or something. And in a broader sense, it's kind of nice that in this book, all of the parents are kind people. Meg's father is kind, even though he's gruff and kind of difficult sometimes, but he has a really good heart. And same with both of Davy's parents. And sometimes these kinds of books can get a little bit too into the kind of grinding misery of, you know, what it would be like to live in medieval Scotland.
It becomes after school special, like,
yeah,
right? It's like it's really trying to teach you a lesson, really aggressively being like, and you should be very grateful that you live now.
Davy and Meg, at least, have really nice home lives for the most part.
Yeah, their parents are really well drawn. Even like Davy's mother, she really spoils him and dotes on him, but she has character flaws of her own. She's like a terrible drama queen. She's a hypochondriac. And I love that. It's such a real thing. Like, those people exist. I thought that was really striking and cute. Meg's father is such an interesting character in that way because he does broker a deal to sell his daughter in marriage. He's sort of consolidating power in this way. But this was normal at the time, and he loves her, which is a complicated way to portray an arranged child marriage. It would be seen as really horrible if he wasn't so loving. If he didn't really say to her, like, you can do this. You know, I believe in you. I believe that you can child marriage. The loving parents go so far to making this feel really real, and also to making the past feel really real. I think sometimes the past can have this kind of gauziness to it, and we get the idea that people in the past were nothing like us now. And they were barely humans. They were so different and they didn't think the same way. But parents did love their kids. Yeah. Children were naughty and people were hypochondriacs. And the detail that this world is painted with is so nice.
You're seeing the characters kind of as these real people that you could believe lived today with similar character traits. And, you know, the kids are so much in the action and so much on eye level. As a kid, that was one of the things that really appealed to me, was that, like you said, it didn't feel like this distant, gauzy past. I was like, oh, I feel like these are people I would want to be friends with.
They're so mischievous and naughty. I think that's a huge part of what makes them so relatable. Did any feelings or memories come up for you about anything just while you were reading this? Did it make you think of 12-year-old Anne?
Yeah, it did. It made me think of what it was like to be at the library. And it was the first time I was at the library by myself, picking out my own books, taking out my own books without anybody seeing what I was taking out, and kind of feeling that independence and that power of not just being able to make my own choices, but to have privacy over my own choices, I guess.
I wish there was some way that we could know who the librarian was that made that display, because I think it can be a kind of thankless job. They never know if they have an impact on somebody by putting the right book in front of them. She might not even be with us anymore, but somewhere there's a librarian that made an impact on you by getting the right book in front of the right person. So in each episode, we choose a theme to read the text through, and we have chosen the theme of power. What's one place that you see the idea of power show up?
I think so early on, we see Inga kind of flexing her power as a witch, and Meg feels quite ambivalent about it because it's not the sister she knew. She knew Inga had some abilities, but she hadn't known up until then exactly what Inga could do. And it's something that, from Meg's perspective, is taking Inga away from her family. And also, Inga, in her thirst for power, is ready to not disown her family, but leave them in the rearview mirror.
She very explicitly says that she's trading this dark favor, murdering the king, for power. She wants to be in the court of this noble Norman family. And I'm not sure if it's ever sort of explicitly said, although I think we get the sense that she's kind of bored at home. Mm-hmm. And she's not being used to her full potential. She has so many powers.
Yeah, and she refers to her family as the fools in the midden. Midden being like a garbage pile.
She wants bigger and better things, or possibly bigger and worse things. She just wants out. And I think she sees them as kind of powerless. They're kind of in a backwater. Inga's powers is so interesting to me because I do think that sometimes we can get really caught up in our usual readings of things like witchcraft. And I know that, like, kind of like the conventional feminist reading of witchcraft was that this was a scapegoating that was taken out for like things that might be going on in the community, on powerless women, on single women, on widows, like on poor women, or that it was an attempt to check women's power. These were women that were maybe in business for themselves or were in some way challenging the established power structures and had to be brought to heel through these witch trials, these trumped up charges that would take place. That's not what's going on here.
No, she's a witch.
She straight up is a witch, and she uses her powers to murder people.
Yeah, her like secret Norwegian powers or Viking powers.
They get a little bit out of control, almost like a horse galloping off and the driver, losing control is kind of like the experience that she has with power. She never learns to have discernment over her power. It seems like you have a lot of affection for Inga. How do you read that character? How do you approach that? Is she a villain?
I think it's complicated. Even when she's saying mean things about her family, I could feel sympathetic in being like, oh, yeah, I think a lot of people know what it's like to be 18 and be like, I'm better than all of these people and I want to get out and I am smarter than everyone I know. Like every 18-year-old thinks they're smarter than everyone they know.
Yeah, it's a normal thing to feel, but imagine you feel that and you also have the power to really do something about it. That would be intoxicating at that age. It's not surprising that she used it to do a little regicide.
Yeah. I think it would have been so easy and probably so tempting to make her evil. She's not evil. She's amoral. She doesn't think it's bad or good to kill the king. She'll do it because somebody is paying her. But she's not like, oh yeah, that guy deserved it. Afterwards, she's like, yeah, it was kind of sad. He was a good king.
She's like existentialist or something. That she just doesn't have that Christian morality. And there is an unanswerable question about where her power comes from and who she serves, because there's a few hints, but we never learn.
Right. And also, Meg has some powers, and Inga kind of says, had you developed them, you could have powers, but thankfully you never did, and you kind of implies you wouldn't want this burden. So is it like genetic? Was their mom a witch? We don't know.
That's so interesting that power is a burden and that different people would handle it differently. And it's better for some people to not have power. I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, there's two little hints. One where Inga lays dying and says something about how she served her master. Master, I don't know, is it a pagan deity? Is it the devil? We don't know. And then we also hear that she kind of cries out to her God, but not capital G God, when she's being tried by water. I think you could speculate wildly about the source of Inga's power. And I like to think of it as some kind of Norse deity.
I think that makes sense.
The struggle for political power is the backdrop of this story. And it is the impetus for the quest in the latter half of the book, where they need to go retrieve the young maid, the bride, who is going to reconcile these nations and allow Scotland to have peace. But Meg is kind of unconcerned with this. Meg doesn't care who the King of Scotland is. No. Right? Like, no. She just doesn't want there to be a war. You talked about how much you love that character, and seeing her motivations or her actions through the lens of power could maybe bring some meaning for us. What do you kind of make of Meg? What did you feel reading at this time? Did you feel that she was that plucky heroine that you remember?
To some extent, yes. She was brattier than I remember her being, and is aware of her brattiness. I will say one thing I didn't remember, and that the cover naturally does not do justice, is that Meg is chubby. She's not a conventionally skinny, beautiful heroine. She's not conventionally attractive. She's a little bit of a chubby girl, and it doesn't really concern her. Like, she's just like, oh, whatever.
If anything, she's sturdy.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's suited to scramble up the side of the whale or survive a sea voyage. It didn't impose 1980s beauty standards on a medieval kid, which many, many books, and I could name a few, Bridgerton, put a completely anachronistic 80s, 90s diet culture lens that just doesn't belong here. That wasn't something that people thought about in medieval times. But they do say a few times that she's no great beauty.
Yeah, but it also kind of doesn't hold her back. There's a point towards the end when she's in the Orkney Islands. She doesn't realize that Davy and her other friend Peem have put around this rumor to kind of quash any men or boys who might be interested in her. And she's like shocked. She's like, why are none of the boys flirting with me? I am used to having boys flirt with me. And it's like, yeah, Meg, get it.
Yeah, it's like, it's her right. She's like, this should be happening. Something is not right. And she's right. Something isn't right. They told everyone that she was promised to Pim. There's such a rich thing in there around the romance, a little bit of a thin romance. This story is not a romance.
No.
How did you interpret the last minute, actually, I love him?
Hated it. I was like, keep it out of here. Don't care.
Yeah, I've been reading Hannah McGregor, so I've been reading some theory around this, and there's been some work around how to read girls' literature, which sometimes it's called sentimental literature, that it has these plucky heroines, and they're very brave, and they sometimes even sort of break social conventions. And the reason for that, or one way to sort of read that, is that they're doing all of this stuff, and meanwhile, adulthood is looming. McGregor here is quoting Jia Tolentino in a wonderful essay called Pure Heroine. When we look at the plucky heroine trope, your Anne Shirley's, your Jo Marches, even your Hermione Grangers, these childhood characters are so independent, so eager to meet every challenge, but adulthood is looming, and adulthood in this universe is synonymous with marriage and children, and in effect, the end of that independence. And the social purpose of this literature is that it's a sort of training manual for white women who are going to be the moral drivers of the nation, who are not going to be involved in politics, which that really rang true. This fits. I think this theory fits with this text. They're not going to be involved in politics. Instead, they're going to be guiding the collective in the direction of moral purity. So once I read that, I was like, you know what? That's true. All of the power that Meg exercises is at the interpersonal level. She rescues people that have no power. She rescues Pim, who is an escaped slave boy, and she rescues this beggar woman. But she doesn't have any civic sense. She doesn't care who the King of Scotland is. And the end of this plucky phase is going to be to settle down in marriage with one of the two boys.
Yeah.
Oh.
You know, from the beginning of the book, she's going to marry Davy. And that doesn't really bother her. That is something that I found interesting on this reread that I hadn't remembered, is that she's kind of like, yeah, I gotta marry someone. He seems nice enough. Like, I'm sure we'll make it work. And then in the end, she does make her own decision about who she's going to marry. And it's not disappointing to Davy. He's like, whatever. I didn't even want to get married anyway.
Any other thoughts on power and where we see power before we move on to our close reading segment?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of characters in the novel are interested in power in one way or another. Meg's father, he's an outsider. He arrives in Scotland as a young man and as an enemy and would have been killed, except he's both pitiable because his leg is amputated, but they also kind of respect him because he amputates his own leg.
He's kind of hardcore.
Yeah. And the Scots like that. He's quite interested in amassing power. He wants the institutional approval that he has kind of been lacking as, you know, this respected and fairly wealthy shipwright, but still a foreigner.
No noble blood.
No noble blood, yeah.
Seeing him broker power through a marriage was really interesting, and seeing that as being kind of legitimized, like this is how it's done. And he had a good eye for power in that way. One more place I see it is with Marie.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
With little Marie, who doesn't want anything to do with power.
Because she understands it in a way that the other children don't.
What do you think she understands?
I think she understands how dangerous it is to be someone who is on paper so powerful, but physically so powerless. She really understands that her life is on the line and she's probably gonna die. In the way that the other kids, I don't think really get.
No. It's another example of power being a burden.
Mm-hmm.
Inga's power is a burden and Marie's power is a burden. And she would rather be a servant than be a queen. Yeah, she could have a grand house and tons of servants and a pretty lush life, but I guess would always be looking over her shoulder for the next assassination attempt.
Right, like Inga would rather die as a noblewoman, and Marie would rather live as a servant.
They are mirror images of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Inga is willing to suffer for power, and Marie is willing to suffer so she doesn't have to have power. I wouldn't have figured that out without you. That was such a good little insight.
Thank you. I literally just thought of it.
For this close reading segment, we are doing a condensed and adapted version of a close reading method from Anna Carter Florence called 6 Questions. It comes from her book, Rehearsing Scripture. It's designed for reading the Bible, but I think it works really well for any text. The passage we have chosen is from chapter 1, when Inga uses magic to kill the king. We've arrived at our close reading segment. This is the time where I like to say that we turn the book upside down and try to shake out some new meanings. Anne, could you read us that short passage?
Sure. As I crouched there, the blackness before me seemed to open. I saw as if from a window in a dark room a man in a blue cloak on a fine gray horse galloping too fast for safety along a wet path on a cliff edge. Without warning, a woman in a green dress, Inga, stood before him, waving her arms. The man shouted silently and dragged at the rein. The great horse reared, twisted aside, and, coming down, found no earth below its hooves. It slipped slowly down out of my sight, eyes rolling, screaming in soundless terror. The man's cloak blew up as he crashed down the rocks to the sea crawling black below. Then there was darkness before me again, and Inga wailed once.
What a passage. What is the part in this text that really gets you?
First of all, it's always worse when an animal dies than a person. There's that. You don't see the king's reaction to being forced off the path and over a cliff, but you get this very close reaction of the horses, and it's horrifying, and it's even more horrifying that it's silent.
Yes, the silent scream. Okay, let's take it a little bit more broad. What do you know? Because this part of the text really gets to you. It could be something about yourself or something about the world or the text.
It makes me think of how scary it would be to be dependent on this huge animal with something of a mind of its own to get you from place to place. Even though I also think cars are bad and scary.
But imagine if cars had feelings.
Yes, and they scream when you got into a car accident.
That is so much scarier.
Yeah.
And I have a long abiding fear of being hit by a car, being in a car accident. I think it's a justified fear. But that's scarier. You have another living being that you're responsible for.
And it's kind of this sort of symbiotic relationship in a way that the horse is depending on you to keep it safe with good guidance, and you're depending on the horse.
That's just a fundamental difference between how people in the past had to move through the world and how we get to move through the world. And the final question is, because of how this got you, what does the community need to hear? What do you hope that these words will do for them?
The horror of this moment is so finely drawn and so clearly felt, first by Meg and then by the reader interpreting it as Meg sees it. And in this moment, Meg's not even seeing him as a king. She's seeing him just as a human getting into a horrible accident.
I really resonated with how you talked about how the scary thing here is the silence.
Yeah.
And I think one way to turn that idea around would be like just because the suffering is kind of unheard, unperceived. Or it's someone like a horse that is not really perceived as a fellow being, but rather as a tool, as a mode of transportation. You can't really say that we're dehumanizing a horse because...
Right.
But I think it could be a call to notice the unseen terrors that come along with really scary things like a regicide that we would all pay attention to. And we can imagine a analogous event to this, like a presidential candidate being assassinated. You know, that's almost regicide. But there was another person there who was shot and killed, and he's hardly heard about, hardly thought about. You nudged me to that by talking about how scary the silence is.
And I think, too, there is something sort of existentially awful about experiencing this version of this horrible event, but having one facet of your sensory input not there.
Oh, yes.
It's almost worse than if Meg could hear the horse screaming. It's like feeling an invisible presence in the room, but not knowing where it is. And that makes it worse than seeing a ghost in the corner or something.
No, it's so scary. I'm kind of picturing it like almost like a projector or something, because like they're all seeing this vision together.
Yeah.
Yeah, the passage struck me because it's our first illustration of Inga's true power. She like astral projected herself into this man's path.
Yeah, and it's like, has Inga ever done this before? Did she just, like, kind of know she could do this, but she wasn't sure? Has she practiced? A lot of unanswered questions.
There's a great unanswered question. She's too good at this.
Yeah.
She knows what she's doing.
Yeah. Has she killed before?
Has she killed before? This never occurred to me before. This was way too smooth. And she wasn't looking at Asa being like, Asa, can I really kill someone with my powers? She was like, all right, let's go.
Yeah.
Regicide is coming right up. Here's my price. Like, we are thrown right into this world.
Yeah, I mean, this literally happens on page 16 in my book. You know, the narrative itself starts on page 3, so we're really only 13 pages into the story, and there's regicide on page 13.
This book is not for babies.
No.
No. Thank you for doing that close reading practice with me. Yeah. We're nearing the end of our time together, and it's time for our closing questions. Thinking back to 12-year-old Anne versus current day Anne, what did you take from this versus what she did? What do you think that you have gained from reading it again?
I really enjoyed reading it again, and there are certainly things that struck me as an adult that did not strike me as a child. For example, I think this is really well written as an adult, which is not something I would have thought about as a kid. I was more like, is the plot interesting? Do I like the characters? But I also just think this is like a pretty finely crafted little novel.
I never knew what was going to happen next. Each thing was so crazy. And the final quest is pretty late in the story. Something I noticed as an adult that I think that I wouldn't pick up on as a kid is that Meg has a teeny tiny bit of main character syndrome.
Yes.
They even remark on it. They're like, you're always here.
Yeah, why do you always have to be in the middle of everything? Like, can you not just, like, listen when someone tells you to stay out of something?
But no, she has to be enacting daring rescues, like multiple daring rescues.
Yeah.
It is a trope, but it's a worthy trope in kids' literature. And it's okay. I think, like, as a kid, you're always being dragged from place to place. You're never the main character.
Something else that strikes me is that I feel a lot more empathy for Inga as an adult, both in the sense that when I read it, I was around Meg's character's age. You know, I was a tween, and so that was definitely who I identified with the most, and of course she's the protagonist. But now as an adult, and as not just one of several sisters in a family dealing with the complexity of relationships between sisters, but also as the oldest sister who had to do a lot of caregiving of my younger sisters in the way that Inga has to do a lot of parenting because their mother is dead. And I feel much more ambivalence about Inga than I did when I first read it. I'm like, oh, I don't think you're necessarily like a good person, but I do think that in some understanding of the word, you love your family, you love Meg, but you also feel resentful of Meg, and that comes out in how quickly and easily she turns on Meg through this misunderstanding.
That really scary line that comes back, she said, if you scratch me, I'll scratch back. And you realize that actually she's been stewing in resentment potentially for a while. I'm also an older sister. I don't think I would have picked up on that as a kid either.
Mm-hmm.
And you've made me think about what we have not seen, which is what takes place before the opening of the story, and all of that labor that Inga did to help raise her younger siblings. She's potentially being a bit held back from reaching her full potential, and she has this massive potential. She has so much power and is at home caring for their bratty little sisters.
Yeah. And I know when I was that age, I mean, I wasn't an evil witch, but I could not wait to get out of the family home, could not wait. And when I graduated high school, I moved across the country to Halifax, and I was like, see you guys never, like, bye.
Yeah, and it's understandable why that is an impulse when you've had that caregiving role and you've had that responsibility, that eldest daughter responsibility. Great insight. And wow, did we ever get a fuller picture of Inga through this conversation. Finally, it's time for shelf or stacks, library or archive. So we know that not every book can be a classic, not even ones that we love. We always have to make choices. You found this because it was shelved at the library, but not everything gets to stay on the shelf. Some things have to go down to the stacks. They go down the stairs, into the basement, into storage, or they get scanned and go into an archive, and they get weeded, to use the library term, to make room for new things. Only a very select few are shelved in perpetuity. Classics. So for this book, do you think library or archive, shelf or stacks?
I think you could make an argument for either. And I think probably the more rational argument would be for stacks, because as you pointed out, there are certainly things happening in this book that aren't really happening in children's fiction today. And there is quite a language gap. But in spite of all of that, I'm going to say shelf, because I think this book rules.
Awesome. I asked you to make the call and you made the call. It's always really tough. And Thériault, thank you so much for spending this time with me. Where can we find your work? And is there anything you are working on that you would like to share?
You can find my work in The Walrus, my series Queens of Infamy on long reads. And since I very briefly mentioned Isabella of Spain, who does eventually become Edward II of England's wife, there is actually an installment of Queens of Infamy about her, and she is also quite a young girl. She's 12 when she marries her husband, who is fully an adult. I think he's in his 20s. So parallels. And I am currently working on a book about a medieval saint and the radical mental health program that she inspired.
Saint Dymphna is my favorite saint.
Yeah, me too.
We'll put that link in the show notes on my Patreon so that you can find the relevant Queens of Infamy piece by Anne Thériault. Thank you so much for joining me, Anne.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pages Past is a production of Yikes Media. It's hosted by me, Jenna Buck, and produced by Caleb Buys. Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you so much for listening. Keep up with the show at pagespastcast.com or on Instagram at pagespastcast. Get early updates and free extras by joining the free Patreon at patreon.com/pagespast. That's PAST. You can also become a paying patron. Through Patreon, this project is funded and made possible by listeners like you. Thank you. Special thanks to Hillary, Alex, Robin, Sam N, Sam E, Mike Schubert, and everyone at the Stony Brook University Podcast Incubator. Questions and responses on this program are edited significantly for length and clarity. I make every effort to represent conversations faithfully. Training any automated program on this content is prohibited by the copyright holders. Until next time, I hope all your library holds come in early, and happy reading.